Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to this live stream for Windows Server 03. So I just want to share my screen. Okay, configuring security. There are several aspects involved with remote access security configuration, the most fundamental of which involves configuring the types of authentication and encryption the server will use when accepting client requests. We will look at each of these in the following sections. Controlling server security. The security tab of the server's properties dialog box allows you to specify which authentication and accounting methods RRAS uses. You can choose one of two authentication providers by using the authentication provider drop-down list. Your choices include the following: Windows authentication. This is a built-in authentication suite included with Windows Server 2003 Radius Authentication. This allows you to send all authentication requests heard by your server onto a Radius server for approval or denial. You can also use the accounting provider drop-down list on the security tab to choose between Microsoft developed accounting, in which connection requests are maintained in the event log, and Radius accounting, in which all accounting events are sent to a Radius server for action. When you select the Radius authentication option from the authentication provider drop-down menu, you are enabling a Radius client that passes authentication duties to a Radius server. Click the Configure button to open the Radius authentication dialog box. From here, you can click the Add button to add the name or address of a Radius server that the RAS server will pass authentication duties to. You must also enter the correct secret, which is initially set by the Radius server. The secret is similar to a password but adds a layer of security to the connection between the RAS server and the Radius server. The timeout option determines how long the RAS server will attempt to authenticate the remote user before giving up. The initial score option is similar to the cost value used by routers. The RAS server will attempt to authenticate users on the Radius server, which asserts to the Radius. Okay, let me start this again. The RAS server will attempt to authenticate users on the Radius server with the highest score first. If that attempt fails, the RAS server will use the Radius server with the next highest score, and so on. Finally, the port option can be changed, but the default setting is part of RFC 2866 Radius accounting and should not be altered unless extraordinary circumstances dictate such. Figure A12, the security tab of the RRAS server properties dialog box. Select the Windows authentication option from the authentication provider drop-down menu if you want the local machine to authenticate your remote access users. To configure the server by telling it which authentication method you wanted to use, click the Authentication Methods button, which displays the authentication methods dialog box. If you look back over the list of authentication protocols earlier in this chapter, you'll find that one has a corresponding checkbox here: EAP, MS-CHAP v2, MS-CHAP, CHAP, SPAP, and PAP. You can turn on totally unauthenticated access by clicking the Allow Remote systems to connect without authentication checkbox, but that is not recommended because it allows anyone to connect to and use your server, and thus by extension your network. There's actually a special set of requirements for using CHAP because it requires access to each user's encrypted password. Windows Server 2003 normally doesn't store user passwords in a format that CHAP can use, so you have to take some additional steps if you want to use CHAP. First, enable CHAP at the server and policy levels. Next, you need to edit the default domain GPO's password policy object to turn on the store password using reversible encryption for all users policy setting. After you've done that, each user's password must be either reset or changed, which forces Windows Server 2003 to store the password in reversibly encrypted form. After these steps are completed for an account, the account can be used with CHAP. These steps aren't required for MS CHAP or MS CHAP v2. For these protocols, you just enabled the desired version of MS CHAP at the server and policy levels. So you can see here figure 8.13, the authentication methods dialog box. In exercise 8.5, you're going to configure your RRAS server so that it accepts only inbound calls that use the IP protocol. You may have to skip some steps as noted if you don't have all of the 4 network protocols loaded. So 1, open the RRAS MMC snap-in by selecting Start, Administrative Tools, Routing and Remote Access. 2, navigate to the server whose authentication support you want to change. Select the server and then select Action, Properties to open the server properties dialog box. 3, switch to the security tab. Make sure that Windows authentication is selected in the authentication provider dropdown. 4, click the authentication methods button. The authentication methods dialog box appears. 5, select the extensible authentication protocol EAP checkbox. 6, select the 2 MS CHAP checkboxes. 7, select the CHAP checkbox. 8, verify that the SPAP and PAP checkboxes are cleared. 9, verify that the allow remote systems to connect without authentication checkbox is cleared. 10, click the OK button when the server properties dialog box reappears. Click its OK button. 11, you will be asked if you want to view the help files associated with configuring authentication protocols. Click No to finish the exercise. Controlling security at the policy level. You can apply authentication restrictions at the policy level too. As you saw in the preceding sections, policy level settings don't exactly override the server settings. For example, you could configure your server to allow CHAP, MS CHAP, and MS CHAP v2, and then set up a policy that would prevent some users from using CHAP. On the other hand, if you disable CHAP at the server level, you can't build a policy that will magically allow it. Having said that, one key point to remember is to configure your server with the sum of the authentication methods you want to be able to use, and then create specific policies that limit which authentication methods and other settings, particularly dial-in constraints individuals or groups can use on that server. Configuring a Radius IAS server. Microsoft's implementation of Radius is called Internet Authentication Service, IAS. IAS provides Radius clients and proxy servers with authentication services. It is particularly useful when you have several remote access servers because it centralizes the authentication, authorization, and accounting for all your remote access users. When an IAS server is part of an Active Directory domain, it uses Active Directory to authenticate users. The IAS console includes a remote access policy node that is used in exactly the same way you use the remote access policies node on an RAS server, which you saw earlier in this chapter. You install IAS using the Add Remove Windows Components wizard. Selecting the Networking Components option, click the Details button and select Internet Authentication Service. After IAS is installed, you can access it through the Internet Authentication Service, MMC, in the Administrative Tools Programs Group 1. So from within the IAS snap-in, right-click the Radius client folder and select New Radius Client Command 2. Enter a friendly name and the enter a friendly name and the name or IP address of your Radius client and click Next. 3. Select the client vendor type. The default of Radius standard typically works fine, and enter and confirm the shared secret. Remember that the Radius client must enter the shared secret as well in order to use the IAS server. 4. Click the Finish button and you will see the Radius client listed in the right pane. To delete a client from the list, right-click the client name and select the Delete command. To change the attributes of the client, such as the IP address or shared secret, double-click the client name to open the Properties dialog box. So this concludes Chapter 8. So the next chapter 9 is managing IP routing. So I'm going to leave it here this evening for this live stream for listening, and have a nice evening.